Good afternoon, sir. Your book Nationalism Without a Nation in India is different from most accounts of nationalism, as it tells us how nationalism was largely an upper caste response against lower caste formations that were happening all over India. Can you tell us more about the main arguments in your book?
See, you have mentioned that in fact nationalism is an inclusive concept, but that inclusive concept has been deployed for sectional and sectarian purposes. The main argument was when the colonial rule actually polarized Indian society, which was basically on between the upper caste and the so-called lower caste groups. The response of the upper caste has been to sort of throw away the British rule, so that the processes of polarization and the somewhat marginal empowerment of the so-called lower caste could be arrested. In fact, the rise of Indian nationalism, I have suggested, took place precisely at that moment when British, by various force of circumstances, were beginning to sort of reach out to the outlying groups, marginal groups, and the rise of nationalism addresses this problem, saying that our tradition is at stake and our unique synthesis, social synthesis is being disturbed, etc., etc. But the point is, this tradition itself was being set up by the British colonial people as a monolithic, singular and kind of organic tradition, which was basically Brahmanical tradition, and against which many of these marginal communities were struggling. In fact, the sociological point I have been trying to make out is that nation is a new social formation of politics, justice, equality, inclusion, which are all supposed to be handled by the new entity called the state, nation and the state. If that is so, the Indian nationalism did not and did not support, and in fact it went against such a formation. And so we are loaded up with a lot of rhetoric on nationalism, but actual social formation of a nation has been arrested and pushed behind. This is in the central argument in the state.
Of your work in academics, and what are the different kinds of responses you got? Has anyone written a critic about it?
There have been some reviews. All the reviews have been generally appreciative of the work, except of course they also have mentioned that I have somewhat exaggerated the egalitarian traditions of the so-called lower caste groups. But that depends on interpretation, how you look at the lower caste groups and so on. Apart from that, the few, I mentioned, the few academic reviews have been all appreciative. But I have not had a serious review from the Indian academics. Most of the efforts have been to let the book go by. Why do you, the moment you take it seriously, either positively or negatively, then the debate starts. So let not the debate start. That kind of impression I always had. But over the years, slowly the consciousness of this book has been seeping into the academics in a slow but a tortuous way. Mainly among the youngsters and the new faculty members and people who already were feeling marginalized within academics and so on. But but still it has to yet to make a place for itself. And also for the issues I have raised have not been discussed sufficiently within the academic, either sociology or political science or even history and so on. I do have that kind of grievance with that.
And what is the main point which you try to, which you think that point is not addressed in the various arguments? In some points.
You see, the academic disciplines, as they are divided in our country, as such, have not addressed the macro and the long-term issues like nationalism, nation formation, etc., and so on. So the constraints are, if you are addressing a nationalism, you read it in history. Or nationalist ideology, you discuss it in politics. And sociology itself has not been forthcoming in understanding nationalism and nation formation in India. And in all these discussions, academic discussions, the general point I would like to point out from within the study of nationalism is that the normative socio-political theory is not sufficiently being recognized and given its due. People take for granted things like nationalism, secularism, communalism, and democracy and all that as though already they exist, and the fact that we have the formal institutions or the formal articulations that we are secular, that we are a nation, that we are a democracy and so on, has been accepted for a kind of truth, like academic truth. Whether these things, the existence of these and the functioning of these conceptual entities are based on certain contingencies and conditionalities, that is not been the strong point of Indian academics. The relation between the normative social theory and the empirical investigations, and this I try to point out in this book, Nationalism Without a Nation. If you are claiming to work towards a nation, formation of a nation, and if you are claiming to be a nationalist, you have to be a participant in modernity, and modernity of political, social modernity, of promoting equality, justice, and liberty, etc. It is not merely a separation from boundary making from earlier British Empire into another boundary called India, but a qualitatively new social formation. Now this, I feel, has not been addressed by any of the people who so far wrote about Indian nationalism. And that's one of the reasons why all those people who so far wrote about Indian nationalism, they really feel a dilemma. How do they react or relate to this book? You see? And I've been waiting to hear some of these big names to take this book seriously and say either good or bad. I mean, I'm waiting to hear of that. That has not happened so far.
Subaltern studies approach to nationalism. What is it that even though they are trying to write an history from below, they are not able to bring the issue of caste and lower caste movements into the work in a useful way?
You see, subaltern studies movement, is addressed better as a subject of sociology of knowledge, how a particular academic school sets itself with a crisis of historiography. In fact, my own approach while studying, writing this nationalism has been to give a full credit to the very first article in that book, in that series. I mean, this is Pranajit Guha's article, which is some 7-8 pages, where he very accurately focused on the problem or the failure of the nation to emerge, which simply meant the failure to hegemonize, that is, bring within the hegemonic politics the aspirations of the subaltern movements and their aspirations, etc. But once having said that, what has happened was, from ever since the actual studies started, most of them have been, one thing is micro, without showing much implications for the larger social formation that was taking place. Secondly, there seems to be some kind of, a deafening silence, like on the question of caste. Obviously, they have reached the very dead end of analysis on class, and they are looking out for another anchoring point, and also seem to be an equal concern not to land in caste. This I say simply because there is such a lacuna all across, except maybe one or two later, much later included, Bandhavadhyay's article and so on. But generally speaking, they have turned a blind eye to the culture-specific subalternity. But this is what I call. There are subalternities everywhere of all kinds and all formations. But for a society, in order to run in a kind of manageably smooth way, all the subalternities and hegemony on the other side coalesce into some kind of accommodative subaltern cultural formation. And that point with regard to the subcontinental society has been on the fault line of caste, understood in an ideological sense. And this has been continuously being pointed out in all the economic studies, the sociological studies, and even political studies, etc. But history somehow has chosen to say that caste is a local problem, caste is a micro problem, it does not have any political repercussions and political implications and so on. And it is very easy to say that most of the authors of subaltern studies are of a particular group from a particular region and particular kind of social scale and so on, and that would be true. That would be true. But then beyond all this, there seems to be a kind of resistance to bring in caste, except by way of studying, for example, Dalit atrocities as and when they happen, or an untouchability, untouchability formulated in the most literal sense by the nationalist leaders and so on. There has been a national consensus on how to look at caste. How to look at caste, which means caste itself has nothing to do with equality or inequality. Caste has over the years acquired certain discriminatory tendencies like untouchability, and once those untouchability aspects have been taken care of, then caste is one of our own invention, our own social synthesis, and there's nothing wrong in being a caste society and so on. This is roughly the nationalist concern. Nationalist concern, the same nationalist concern gets transferred into the academic paradigm mainly through history. Mainly through history. History departments are the guardians of the nationalist repository. And so it is very difficult to introduce caste and all that within historical paradigms and academic frameworks. And unfortunately, these subaltern studies, instead of looking for the subalterns in a more straightforward and a transparent way, has set up subalternities, searched for and set up subalternities in all corners of the countries in order to avoid the most obvious subaltern, pattern of subalternity that was sort of almost striking in the face. And so in that sense, I feel this is mostly a political exercise. Political exercise. And despite the fact that, that this comes as a huge challenge located from various well-known institutional locations across the world, in which case the dilemma is whether it is power or knowledge that is being, being offered through this. I mean, there are some individual articles, I have no problem about this. When you are talking about subaltern studies, what goes mainly as the bulk and the determining bulk, this is what I mean. And more particularly, the later half of the subaltern studies have been increasingly shifted the problem outside the Indian subcontinent as a post-colonial studies. That we are all subalterns vis-a-vis the colonizers, and that is the more important agenda rather than look for the subalterns within the subcontinent. And this thing has come about simply because the original volumes, the beginning volumes of subaltern studies, have not been rooted into the actual subalternity of the masses, which is meaning caste subalternity. So it could easily be hijacked from focusing on the internal dissensions, internal subalternities, etc. Now we have landed with post-colonial subalternity, where we are all concerned about the relations between Indian subcontinent as a whole with its former colonizers. This I feel is a 100% U-turn from the original agenda of Ranajit Guha. In fact, in case I get a chance to meet him, I would like to ask him about that. You started saying that the agenda of subaltern studies is the failure of the nation to emerge and the responsibility placed squarely on the hegemonic classes within the subcontinent. Now we have come to a stage where subalternity is seen as a post-colonial character determining the relationship between colonized and the colonizer. Anyway, this is the fate of the academic movement. Agency in academic analysis of caste. If caste is a graded reality which people all agree, responsibility for maintenance and reproduction of caste also would be graded. Some have greater responsibility, some have lesser responsibility, some have no responsibility. Now these things are never being analyzed within academics. This is the second great lacuna where we find. The third one is naturalization of a particular ideological category as part and parcel of a social science discussion. I mean, without even quotation marks or in italics, we very comfortably speak of upper caste, lower caste, backward caste, forward caste, and so on. I mean, who is a backward, who is a forward, under what register or in what category, in what framework? One is called backward, one is called scheduled, one is called low caste, one is called an high caste. This is a sectarian ideological development. But we seem to use it as though it is some sort of normal category to study Indian society. This is a huge surrender to a particular sectarian ideology. Here it's unfortunate that in India most people are called backward. Most citizens are called backward, and their backwardness seems to be natural, and they have to sort of explain and then come up to the level of I don't know who. You see? These are functions of academics, and they are functions clearly political, and there isn't much knowledge production involved in all this. Now, this has become very acute simply because, particularly on the question of caste, it is not only the institutional academics that is engaged in this. There is a huge world of the struggling mass of people also is struggling to think, understand, grapple with this notion of caste. Now, in the case of caste analysis, we have a complete bifurcation, a total polarization of the idea of caste among the ordinary working group thinking masses outside and the small elitist institutionalized academically trained group speaking on caste. I think the sooner these two come together and learn from each other, it is better for academics.
So don't you think that the face of the social sciences in universities changing with so many Dalit and OBC and students for pro-minority, that is from minority communities coming to it? What do you think of this? Do you think now we can have a more egalitarian, so-called egalitarian social sciences?
You see, it is something very promising, that extremely slow, tortuous, and also in a very compromising manner, that drop by drop the academic scenario is being forced to change. Being forced to change. It's something nice. It's something nice. But it is not at all a sufficient condition for the face of Indian social sciences to change. Because social sciences, as any other sphere of a society, is not a static sphere. If there are one or two people from the other spectrum of power, that is from powerlessness, come into academics, there is also a corresponding change that takes place from positioning, retrieving, and then repositioning of the other side. You see? It's not that earlier certain things were not said inside and certain things are now being said. But those who have been resisting these changes are not also keeping silent. They have been repositioning themselves, re-explaining, re-justification, finding more and more reasons, and so on and so forth. I am not minimizing the small changes that have come, largely due to the self-efforts of the marginalized and the relegated groups, but the nature of those changes that have come have been very severely handicapped and restrained. You see? So much so, their capacity to transform social sciences is not there at all. On the other hand, there is a lot of accommodations being made on the side of the people who are entering into academics. I mean, this is not to belittle the struggle or the achievements of those people who are making within academics, but the objective condition of the Indian society at large and also the Indian academics in particular has to be firmly grasped, and the situation is such that it is not so easily amenable for structural change, because there has been a lot of anchors have been laid already in history and culture to say that minor changes, fragmented changes, micro level changes, disconnected changes do not at all disturb the structural and the deep undercurrent that moves Indian society at large and also the Indian academics in particular.
So tell us something about your publishing venture, Critical Quest.
Well, this is some sort of idea that I thought I had something special to say when I completed my book on nationalism without a nation. Now I felt the need that the way I have come to understand these hardly challenged ideas, it would be better if others also come to know of that. So in fact, the idea of the Critical Quest series came from as soon as I completed my nationalism without a nation. In fact, many of the booklets, if you find, are taken out or shaped into position from my original reading on nationalism without a nation. And in fact, it is a continued on that basis. And from the reception that this series has had, I think it is sort of clear that there is a huge lacunae within academics, and even within the progressive dimension of Indian academics, many of the studies are not in a form readable or ready to be distributed among the reading public. Okay. In fact, my own work as the critical quest is not, many of the works is not my work. It's only maybe half a dozen or a little more than that will be my work. The rest are all brought from various authors. And this collection and the codification and the projection is an editorial in itself. And this has found a resonance among the reading students and younger faculty members and so on, to say that there is something, a message comes through in all these books. Though individual books may be speaking of different things, unconnected things, overall there seems to be a thrust. In fact, that thrust, general thrust and a common trajectory is carried over from nationalism without a nation. And I am very gratified that there has been a good response to that.
So, if I am not wrong, you are from an ex-untouchable, now OBC community from Tamil Nadu. What is your own experience of caste, both while growing up and later?
I have tried to think hard to find some instances of discrimination in my personal life, and I am afraid I didn't find any. I said personal life. But I definitely remember to have had a sense, along with several other people, not necessarily belonging to my caste or so on, but a large group of marginalized communities, that we are all not exactly equal to certain groups, and we are not entitled for certain things. In public sphere, we would be always stand behind or below certain kind of power realization. This was there all along. While, as I said, I could never find out an individual discrimination by which I, because of my caste background, was discriminated. Probably I never, in my own Tamil Nadu background, many of us were some kind of similarly placed communities. But in the public spaces, I have experienced a general sense that we cannot be go forward, or we cannot be bold, or we cannot be confident in articulating certain things or in taking up certain things, precisely because we belong to a reality called a kind of relegated social groups and so on. That would be my this may look like an abstract or a kind of vague feeling, but it has been very strong within me in a sense, and I have tried to use that strategically in order to understand what could be the feeling of the relegated masses in a general way, rather than harp on individual instances of discrimination.
So one example in that context, what you say is also perfectly right, that always there is no proceeding. But let us take one example of Kerala and West Bengal, where there is utterly no Dalit movement at all. There is no movement. Everybody, even every Dalits are with the left movement. But surprisingly, caste atrocities are too much there comparatively, which we speak about, where Dalit movements are prevalent. How do you see these both states?
You see, these indicators are not actually absolute. If there is a caste movement, caste atrocities highlighted, there is a Dalit movement. If there is no caste atrocities, there is no Dalit movement. You see, that is a very, very poor indicator. In fact, I mean, that could be a complex way of understanding all these kind of things. I am not very sure about West Bengal, because West Bengal, I have a feeling it's a question of very thorough marginalization. Very thorough marginalization, so you cannot even raise your head on anything at all. But in Kerala, I have a feeling it is slightly different, and spilling over it may also to some extent to Tamil Nadu also. The meaning of the scheduled caste, now of course it's called Dalit, is not uniform across the country. Has never been uniform across the country in history also. In history, the way the scheduled castes were to be identified in different regions where criteria was very different, and the way the scheduled caste relationship with the non-scheduled caste and also the upper caste was different from area to area to area and so on. Now all these things are brought into one thing for an all India purpose, have been reduced as a single thing called scheduled caste, and then the indicator is singular monolithic, and then the benefits are singular monolithic, and following all these state initiated processes, we also in a responsive manner we say we also have a singular indicator saying this happens, this is all the thing. But I think that is a rather not quite right. For example, the Tamil Nadu would be meaning some of the very high level Dalit atrocities state. Now, a few months ago there was a study, if you remember, the Chamber of Commerce which has done a study, that it was only in Tamil Nadu the 18.5 or some representation of Dalits are to be found in private industry. It's only Tamil Nadu fulfilled that, or no other state fulfilled that. And the curious point is, this was not a quota fulfillment. This was not a quota fulfillment. All those 18.5 Dalits who got into the positions were not chosen because they were Dalits. They were chosen simply because they proved eligible and necessary qualifications they had. Now that would represent a overall indirect and a comprehensive strategy of better well-being for the entire society, in which Dalits also will participate. Dalits also would participate. Now this indicator of Dalits alone being separately being measured, they would come within the measurement certain forms of atrocities, discriminations would come in. Certain other forms would not come in. Certain other forms of empowerment also would not come in. So I would rather suggest a plural way of understanding. How the question you asked, that was how come there is something happening here that is not happening there? How come something happening differently here which is happening indifferently there? That would go a long way to explain the Dalit movement itself. You see, there is the form of integration of Dalits with their own linguistic community is a highly variegated, differentiated and also differently empowered reality. Differently empowered reality. That is my own small book on that, interpreting Kerala's social development is pointing out that. There has been, you see, the Kerala was one of the worst in terms of untouchability and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But very quickly many of them have been removed.
Yeah.
Dalits are oppressed, there is no doubt about that. But the certain forms of oppression that was common, while many other communities are struggling to do that, are not present in Kerala. Now how do we move on to the second level of oppression? It may require a different strategy. It may require a different strategy and an understanding how they are located within that particular social scale.
Okay.
And very often, the final point is very often these discussions take place among groups and individuals who have succeeded in reaching out to a space which is pan-Indian, which seeks to negotiate with the central state. Now, we should not generalize this for the entire population. Our Dalit problem is not the Dalit problem of the mass of people in the country. That is important to remember.
So this is the idea of India as you have shown in your book is highly problematic and full of contradictions, quotes, okay, right from the beginning. So that how do you see that?
You see, for example, I am not part of those who say that India is impossible or possible. Okay? Whether the possibility of India, impossibility of India should be tested on the criteria that such an entity, India or any other entity, is the convenient forum for the well-being of all those people included in it or not, particularly the subaltern groups of people. Now, in that context, the way India has come into existence historically through colonialism, Orientalism, nationalism, etc., etc., I find the formation of India today is purely at the behest of the interests of certain top groups. The term is Brahmanical. Of course, people are feeling very embarrassed to use the word Brahmanical these days, but certain truth has to be said. You see, this is a very mechanical case, and what I am saying is not anything very fantastic discovery. There are a lot of people, including scholars and so on, have said that notion of hierarchical space, a centralized space, is in the interest of social groups which are found across India, which have access to all languages, which have access to all cultures and so on. And then for the others, the idea of nation is the surrounding reality, which is limited less than Indian reality. This does not mean at all that India needs to be broken. I am not advocating at all that. In fact, there is a unity across the country. There has been a unity across the country, but that unity has been underlying unity, and the manifest reality is plurality. Now, what is being sought through the dynamics of the modern Indian history is this underlying unity is being suppressed and a unity is being imposed on top. Unity is being imposed on top. That is one of the reasons why there is such a separatist sort of tendencies all across. All separatism in this subcontinent is based on the fact that they are not being given equal treatment. This is the one thing very firmly has to be understood. All the question of identity and all that is very secondary. The basic thing is, within the identity that has been constructed and called India, I do not get my equality. I do not get my equal respect, equal dignity, equal recognition, etc., etc. That is why, at least in academic understanding, if we could have a lesser reality, regional reality, as the framework in which we study the subaltern struggles, Dalit empowerment, quota reservation, etc., etc., we would come up with a more real and more substantial, more existential reality than this amorphous and some kind of formal thing called India, and then how Dalits are doing or not doing in India and all that. This is the kind of understanding. Now, in the course of actualizing this equality within regions, equality within the ecologically developed regions, may or may not end up by remaining with or without India. That is, each one is a future problem that will be taken care of. If that is possible, it would definitely not break India in a mechanical sense. For example, India of certain kind of possible equality I envisage, the center would be merely a coordinating center with a very loose thing, and then work it out regionally different kind of social politics. On the other hand, what we see today, the witness is that parallel, what do you call that constitutional section?
Directive principle.
No. State subject and central subject, and there is one thing called
directive principle.
No. There is also called parallel subject. Now the list of parallel subject keeps on increasing. Simply it has come to me, there are two realities. One is an ordinary reality for ordinary beings, and there is a horned reality of higher beings. Now this higher being reality, for example CBSE and IITs and IAS organizations, all these are supposed to be the all India realities. And all India realities, you know very well, is the most hierarchically nurtured and structured reality, with very little access to. Now this two-tier reality is the basic way in which we have organized polity, which simply means Avarna reality. India is a caste. So India is a caste country. We don't simply say because there are castes. It's a caste structured country. Now we can. And in my own book, actually the problem is not India is a problematic thing. Actually my own problem was taking for granted all these differences remain if at that given point in time in history had our politicians been statesmen-like and carried over an agenda of egalitarian homogenization, of power homogenization, uniform universal education for example, many of the subsequent problems would not have cropped up. But even today, for example, uniform universal education, the implementation of which for 10 to 15 years would simply remove many of the contestatious elements of caste, reservation, etc. But they won't do it. It's only in that context India increasingly becomes a problematic entity.